If you're learning Spanish, you've probably considered creating your own Spanish flashcards to quiz on your new vocabulary. In the previous video, I covered strategies for turning even the simplest Spanish flashcards into a tool for becoming truly fluent in Spanish. But now it's time to upgrade your flashcards themselves. If you follow the 5 tips in this video, you'll soon have flashcards that are actually shortcutting your way to fluency. The first tip, as I mentioned in the previous video, is to have English on one side of your flashcards and Spanish on the other. When quizzing, you'll start by looking at the English side first and trying to guess the Spanish. I know there are a lot of people who prefer to put pictures on their flashcards rather than English, in the name of not translating. The argument goes something like this. If you're putting English on your Spanish flashcards, you're going to be looking at English every time you work on Spanish. Therefore, won't it take longer to start thinking in Spanish rather than English, and to stop translating from English in your head all the time when speaking Spanish? But we've found at Accelerated Spanish that this argument just doesn't hold up. An upcoming video will explain why in detail, but in a nutshell, what we've found with the thousands of coaching students that we've personally trained in Spanish fluency is that the fastest way to fluency is actually through your native language. Being an English speaker is not a disadvantage to learning Spanish. On the contrary, there are many ways that you can actually use English to learn Spanish much faster. And one of the best ways is to use English on your flashcards. Of course, you need to make sure that your translations are clear and accurate. There's nothing worse than learning an erroneous translation and turning that into a part of your Spanish voice. The rest of the tips in this video will help you avoid some of the common pitfalls of creating Spanish flashcards. Tip number 2 is to use phrases. When you're making your cards, use phrases whenever you can. Don't just write down nervous as nervioso. Instead, maybe say she got nervous on one side and se puso nerviosa on the other. This way you're still learning the word, but you're learning it in a context where it's usable. It doesn't exist as a disembodied element of the language. It connects to other things that you know in Spanish. You'll more quickly be able to use the word in a real context, even in a spontaneous sentence context that you've never used it in before, if you follow both this advice and the quizzing tips that I gave in the previous video on how to use Spanish flashcards to become fluent. Of course, the question is, how long of a phrase should you use on your flashcards? It depends on the word, and you should use your own judgment. Generally, I find that the ideal average length for a flashcard is about 3 words. That's long enough to give a word a little bit of context, but it's short enough that you don't have to spend too much time on every single flashcard. If you're putting 10-word phrases on most of your flashcards, you're going to get exhausted and give up on reviewing them very quickly. Of course, when you write these phrases on your flashcards, you want to make sure that they're accurate. If you have a native-speaking friend or a coach, like the excellent coaches that we have at Accelerated Spanish, you should run your flashcards by your coach to make sure that you're not practicing wrong. Even better, you can steal the phrases that you put on your flashcards directly from a source written by a native Spanish speaker. For example, if you're reading an article about birds and you stumble across the term envergadura alar, after you look that up and find out what it means, which is wingspan, you might decide to make a flashcard about that so that you remember it. Go ahead and take the whole phrase from the context, maybe something like proportional to its wingspan, or proporcional a su envergadura alar. Now that may sound well and good, but where should you get those native written phrases? There are 2 main answers to where you should get the materials for your flashcards. One answer if you're more of a beginner or a lower intermediate learner and you're still working on your Spanish grammar and syntax. And another answer if you've pretty much mastered Spanish grammar and are more intermediate or advanced. Tip number 3 is to collect ideas for your flashcards from the frequency list. And this is mainly for beginner and intermediate learners. If you're still struggling with your Spanish pronouns and frequently used verbs, such as ser, estar, and haber, then here are some of the best places to get your Spanish flashcards. So step 1 is to go to the top of the frequency list. Start by going to a good Spanish frequency list. My favorite is the Wiktionary list that I've linked in the description of this video. Start at the top of the list where you'll see words like que, de, lo, and te. Any of these words in the top 300 or so are extremely important to quiz on extensively as early on as possible. But as you look at the list to choose words for your flashcards, There's a common trap that many Spanish learners are going to fall into, including learners who are in an intermediate level and feel like they've learned these words. So you might look at a word on the list like te, tell yourself, oh yeah, I know that word, and then choose not to add it to your flashcards. It's not just a question of whether you're familiar with the word. The most important questions are, first, are you able to use these words correctly and proficiently? Second, do you know the less common nuances of how to use these words? And third, do you sound like a native speaker when you use these words? And then, of course, are you using these words all the time? Since these words are at the top of the frequency list, that means that native speakers use them all the time. They use them constantly and don't even have to think about them when they use them. If your goal is genuine fluency, then your task is to get to that point as well. So take note of any words that you don't feel extremely confident with at the top of the frequency list, and be prepared to practice them a lot. Step 2 is to find sentence contexts for these high-frequency words. For any of these words high on the frequency list, you need to find lots of Spanish contexts in which to practice them. Since words like por simply don't translate into English, the only way to really get familiar with them is to practice them in lots and lots of contexts that use the word. One of the most reliable places to find these is the online Spanish dictionary SpanishDict.com, linked in the description of this video. It includes lots of sentence examples for pretty much every word you might throw at it at the top of the frequency list, including almost all of the different uses of any common Spanish word. There's one problem with the example from Spanish dictionaries, and that is that even when you're trying to learn a common word like lo or por, the sentence examples in these dictionaries tend to include a lot of less common, less important vocabulary. For example, let's say that you're trying to master the word por in contexts where it means by means of. But the example that the dictionary gives you is a really long sentence. Puedes seguir tu paquete por correo electrónico. Yikes. You'll probably be distracted by all the big, less common words in this sentence, and all you really wanted was to practice por. Fortunately, there is a solution, at least for the top 500 words in Spanish. The resources at SpanishVideoCourse.com are full of native written sentence examples that use only the most frequent words in the language in basically every way that they can be used. I recommend mastering all of these sentence examples before refocusing your attention on vocabulary and phrases that go beyond the top 500 words in the language. Step 3 is to reference grammar charts. There's one more resource to use for Spanish flashcards that will help you master the essential syntax of the Spanish language, and that's verb charts and pronoun charts. At some point or another, you're going to have to learn these things, so it may as well be as soon as possible to get it out of the way. But don't make it boring or useless. For example, you might think that in order to memorize Spanish object pronouns, you have to create a card that looks like this. First of all, that's way too much information for one card. If one of your flashcards looks like that, then anytime you're quizzing on your Spanish, you're probably going to feel a sense of dread, wondering when that card is going to come up and slap you in the face with information overload. You should never dread studying Spanish, so this is a big no-no. And in the second place, this chart is way too impersonal. A bunch of words sitting in columns and rows like this just doesn't directly relate to how we speak Spanish in conversation. But there is a way to work on memorizing these charts with flashcards easily and effectively. Toward the end of the video, I'll show you how to turn these boring charts into flashcards that you can have fun quizzing with and that make these words more and more usable in real life. That's in tip number 5, so stick around for just a little bit longer. Tip number 4 is to collect ideas from real life. And this is largely for intermediate and advanced Spanish learners, so this is for you if you're already speaking somewhat comfortably in Spanish. If you've mastered essential Spanish syntax and you can almost flawlessly use the top 200 words in the language, then it's time to work on the giant task of expanding your vocabulary by thousands and thousands of words. This is where many students get overwhelmed. Now that you're speaking some Spanish fluently, where do you go from here? There are about 100,000 words in the Spanish dictionary. There's no way that you can flawlessly learn all of them in the next few months. Plus, that's a lot of flashcards. If you had just one flashcard per word, you'd have a collection of index cards weighing an estimated 400 pounds or 180 kilograms. At this point in your learning, you want to make steady progress, specifically targeting your weak areas and any parts of the language that are personally important to you. The best method for finding the right new words and phrases to learn is a two-step process. First, use Spanish as much as possible. And second, whenever you get stuck because you don't know a word or a phrase, make a note of it. This may sound like a frustrating process, but if you adopt a growth mindset, you can flip the script and find it encouraging instead. Look at it as good news. When you're not sure what Spanish words to learn next, you can simply use real life to tell you. Every time you run into a word or phrase in Spanish that you don't know, make a flashcard out of it. It's an opportunity to patch up your weaknesses. Here are a few ways to do this. First of all, narrate your thoughts in Spanish. This is one of the lowest pressure ways to find your own missing areas of vocabulary. Whenever you have time, try using Spanish to voice whatever you're thinking. If you find you can't, you've identified a good place for you to grow. Another idea is to text in Spanish. This is also lower pressure than conversation, and it's still a great place to learn where your vocabulary is weak. When you're texting, it's really easy to pause mid-conversation and make a note of a word or phrase that's new to you. If you don't have native Spanish-speaking friends that you text with, I recommend HelloTalk or Tandem, which can connect you with native speakers around the world. And then, of course, there's talking in Spanish. And you saw this coming. There's no getting around having real conversations with Spanish speakers. And as painful as it is, one of the best ways to learn where you're weak in your Spanish is to take note of the difficulties that you have in Spanish conversations. If you don't know how to say something, ask. And if you hear something you don't understand, ask for clarification. Either way, you've identified something that you can get better at using flashcards. Now, whether you're narrating your thoughts in Spanish or texting in Spanish or using Spanish conversations to learn your weaknesses, you should physically write down anything that's new or unfamiliar. I recommend keeping a small notebook so that you can store all of your notes on your Spanish in one place. Then, a couple of times per week, or ideally every day, go through all of these notes and create some new flashcards. As you do this, don't just emphasize words that you don't know. You should also take note of the difficulties that you have with grammar. Even if you feel like you know all there is to know about Spanish grammar, you'll almost always still have some weaknesses that can be improved. We'll talk about how to work on that in this next section. So tip number 5 is to use grammar drills on your flashcards. Whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced, you should be practicing your Spanish grammar regularly. If your goal is to speak deeply and personally with the Spanish speakers in your life, the only way to express yourself accurately and on a level that really connects is to be so comfortable with Spanish grammar that you don't even have to think about it while you're talking or listening. Every beginning Spanish learner should start getting comfortable with verb conjugations, object pronouns, and Spanish sentence structure from the very beginning. And even if you're already speaking Spanish fluently, you should still use your Spanish flashcards to refine and perfect your fluid production of Spanish sentences on a regular basis. But grammar flashcards don't have to be dry or overwhelming. As I mentioned earlier, using entire grammar charts on flashcards is not really going to be that helpful. Instead, your cards should reflect how you'll actually be speaking and hearing Spanish in real life. Here are some tips for making that work. First of all, never put more than about 5 words from a grammar chart on one flashcard. For example, you might just choose to put the 3 most common indirect object pronouns on one card: te, le, and me. Second, when you write the words on the card, try to represent the meanings of these words in some way. I like to do this by putting the words in positions on the card that represent where these people might be in a conversation. Imagine that you're in a circle of people talking to the person across from you in the circle. Now put me at the bottom of the card, te at the top of the card as if it's the person across from you, and le on either side. So your flashcard might look something like this. So this is you're looking across the circle, and you could be talking about one of these people. Also, on the other side of the card, the side that will prompt you to remember this scene and recite these words, don't just say indirect objects. Instead, give a sentence context, such as, in this case, blank, they'll give food. This way, when you quiz, you can remember to fill in the blank with the words that fit this context, so you'll remember the words on the other side. Me, they gave food, te, they gave food, and le, they gave food. Of course, if you're following the guidance from the previous video, you'll be saying these entire sentences out loud as you quiz. This is great practice for actually using your pronouns, not just memorizing lists of them. Verbs are similar. Choose a common verb that you need to practice, and for our example, I'll use estar. Next, for one particular flashcard, you want to choose either one person, such as the third person singular, which would be he, she, it, or one particular tense or mood. So here's one estar card. In this case, I've chosen the third person singular, he, she, it. So the sentence example here is ella blank bien. I've made a footnote that we're reviewing estar, but we're going to be reviewing several conjugations of it because there are several things that could fit in there. So when I see this card, my task is to think of all the ways that she could be well. She could be well in the present tense, the past tense, the future. So I would look at this card and come up with ella está bien, ella estaba bien, and so on, all of the different examples. Now, with this card, we're talking about one person, but in several different tenses. We should also practice estar using just one tense, but switching up the different persons. So it's kind of like going between different dimensions of the verb. So here's another example for estar flashcards. This one says, blank en casa ayer. Now, I've made a footnote on here that we're reviewing estar, but several past tense conjugations in the imperfect past tense. So when I see this card, my response should be estaba en casa ayer, estabas en casa ayer, estaban en casa ayer, and so on, with the first person ones there as well. And once again, I've done this thing where I'm visualizing that we're like in a circle and I'm here and the other person is here. It's just a nice way to remember and to represent on the cards without using a simple list. Of course, as I'm quizzing on this, the order that I recite them in doesn't really matter. As long as I remember all of the target forms of estar in the imperfect past tense and say them in the sentence context, I've done my job. The idea of doing grammar drills like this might be intimidating, especially if you're just starting out learning Spanish. And there's a reason for that. I've intentionally been emphasizing in this video some of the most difficult words to learn in Spanish. Most of what you learn in Spanish will be much easier. The thing is, I recommend starting with what most people neglect and push aside as too hard. But these words are used all the time in every Spanish conversation, and if you do the hard work and master all of the uses of these common words, you can master anything in the Spanish language. Now let's say you're an intermediate or advanced speaker. You should still stay on the lookout for complicated grammar that trips you up. You can use flashcards like these to make it feel more and more natural in conversation. If practicing lists of direct objects is too easy for you, make flashcards with other grammatical elements that you still find tricky, maybe based on complicated grammatical structures, such as, if this were the case, then this would be the case. There's always something to get better at in your Spanish grammatical fluency. So in a nutshell, those are my 5 tips on creating good Spanish flashcards. And in this video and the previous one, I've described both how to create good Spanish flashcards and how to use them in your daily quizzing to become fluent in Spanish. The next video is all about how to schedule your review, and specifically the spaced repetition system that I follow in my own learning. If you want to know how it's possible to learn thousands of new words and phrases every month without being overwhelmed, subscribe and watch for the next video when it's released.